I work for SpeedCurve. We are a performance monitoring vendor. Jason works for Bloomberg on their terminal, and Bloomberg use a custom version of Chromium in their terminal. And as a result of Mark's talk at Performance Now and a bunch of other conversations, we both discovered we have some of the same needs from element timing. So we're going to talk a bit about this today. So element timing allows us to time or measure when a element is rendered to the page. But one of its limitations is it's only applicable to a really small number of elements. So images in SVGs, videos, background images, and it also has grouping of text nodes together. And while I love that, and I love actually being able to choose what I want to measure and encouraging our customers to measure what matters to them rather than what a browser might decide is most important, it doesn't really fit the way we think about the web today, in that when we look at how people are building pages and applications, they're thinking in terms of UI components. They're building pattern libraries and design systems that are based around all sorts of components, from a button right through to a cookie dialog or a product card or menu. There are many different components, and this is how increasingly we're finding people are building the web. And components are really just collections of HTML elements. And we have no way of really timing these as a whole. Sometimes they may be collections of HTML elements wrapped in a div or some other element, and sometimes they're increasingly wrapped as web components. And one of the things I'm not too worried about at the moment is Emil at TPAC in 2022 talked about Microsoft's challenges with measuring the shadow DOM, and I'm not particularly interested, or I don't have a strong interest in measuring the shadow DOM level. I'm more interested in measuring at an atomic component level. And the challenge we have with components as they exist today is we can measure individual elements of that component. So in a product card, we can measure when the image renders or when the text renders. But how useful is that product card, without measuring when somebody can actually use it? So when the button that allows somebody to buy it actually is visible, or there are challenges in that all the content on the page or in all the content in the component may actually not come from the origin. So typically ratings often come from a third-party origin, and there's a question of how do we measure this component as a whole, and which bits of it can we effectively measure? And I've talked about components that are quite complicated, and then I've got some simple examples that are anything but simple in reality. But even being able to measure things like when an SVG renders, when some MathML renders, or when a table renders would really help move some things forward. And as an example of a challenge Jason's facing, he's going to talk a bit about the Bloomberg example.
Yeah. Hi. Hi, for those who don't know me, I'm Jason Williams, a software engineer at Bloomberg. And just like as Andy mentioned, we do use UI and component libraries within the terminal. We've got a practical example here. In the terminal that Andy said, we embed Chromium. And the way that our terminal works, just a little bit like a browser, is we do go from one function to another. And each function, a bit like a page, does have its own set of metrics. So FCP, LCP, INP, and so on. In the image here, we're looking at a function that shows world indices. So this is like our tabular data. This is our main piece of content. And despite it looking like a table, this is actually a set of divs that we've got together in a grid formation, and that makes up our table component. Next slide, Andy. So when this is loaded, when this entire function is loaded, it's giving you market data. We tend to get a div at the top that's got a text node inside. This is usually our LCP candidate, and it's showing the name of the function that you're in. In this case, it's world equities indices. Next slide. So sadly, it's not what we would hope for, or the developers in Bloomberg would hope for. Our main component, our main container of content isn't chosen. We'd expect to. This is what our users would expect to see when they load this function, and the data in this table that we have is for us our main piece of content, and this is what our developers would love to keep track of, and this is what we'd love to be able to know that is rendered and loaded. Next slide. So the question always comes up is, when should a component be considered as rendered? And in the terminal, we don't often construct a view all the time that like a typical web page would construct. For instance, we always dynamically build up our DOM elements, and we stream data in. And sometimes as that data streams in, we build up our DOM. So like I showed you in the previous example where you saw the table of data, we would often start with an empty table, and we would stream market data into those cells or into that grid of divs. We do often care just about the initial paint. So at the end of the day, we are still trying to time when a function that shows you some information has loaded. So we only care about the initial paint. These cells that you saw do obviously repaint because we do have market data that's streaming in all the time. But my team, which is the performance team, we're mainly just focused on when has our main piece of content loaded, and that's what we want to keep track of. There are some challenges that we do need to overcome, such as, well, if we have a component that's showing data and one of the some part of it, or a cell in our case, is empty, do we wait for that cell to be populated before we can say our component is fully rendered? If we go to the next slide. So an idea that we've had, and this is just to sort of initiate some discussion, is that maybe we do show some timing events within a component until we either know a component's rendered or we're past the point where we know the page or the app is rendered. In this example here, I've marked the top level container with an element timing attribute, and I'm signaling that I want to know when this component has painted. So this could just be a typical widget or application that we have. Next slide. So portions of the component would start to paint. So maybe we have another grid in this that's made up of divs. And because maybe we need to fetch the image as this component is loading, the divs load very quick because we don't need to do any fetches for that. Next slide. And one more, Andy. Yeah, there we go. So eventually we've loaded the whole thing, it's painted, and we're getting our timing events coming through as each element inside of our container is being painted. So we can keep track, and we can think of these as candidates, similar to LCP if you like. But even in this case here, like I mentioned earlier, we do stream data in, and we do dynamically add DOM elements when our components are being built. So if you get to the next slide. So something like this could happen while our component's being rendered. And let's say during rendering, a further row is added, and it needs to be painted. So this means it can be tricky to know when one of our components has finished rendering. One option is to copy the strategy of largest contentful paint, and maybe we stop entries coming through once there's been a user interaction. Do the performance element timing entries contain the same top level container for each one of these actions, and then you choose the last one? We're not too sure, but these are some of the challenges that we face when we start talking about how do we solve this sort of problem. And yeah, back to you, Andy.
Yeah, so and we also have some similar sorts of issues to do when is the component considered rendered, in the, you know, all speak of charts start to render as a component block and then dynamically fetch the data in afterwards. And, you know, what we're really interested in is this final state. But the need to cope with dynamic data streaming in, I think, can be separated. I think there are perhaps two separate concerns. There's the example we've both got where we've got dynamic data that we want to be streamed in and measure when that's rendered. But secondly, or primarily, there's the whole concept that pages and apps are built from collections of components, and we want to be able to measure when those components are rendered so that we can measure the experience that people are really having on sites and apps. And finally, we had a bunch of unanswered questions that we dumped in because, you know, what happens if somebody places that element timing on the body element of a complex DOM? How do animations affect the measurements, particularly once we get to components that fade in or slide in? Yeah, should an element timing attribute be considered a signal that the container should be considered for LCP? You know, rather than leaving the browser to pick the largest image, if the container that's marked with element timing is bigger than anything else, should that be LCP'd? And the piece Jason's talked about is when should we decide a container has been painted? And that was our 15 slides on the challenge we want to talk about.
Cool, thank you.
And I'll try and find my mouse so I can stop sharing.
Yeah,